9 of the most shocking unsolved mysteries in England. The war between crimes and justice has been waging since the dawn of man. Crime drama is one of the most popular and varied genres of television and literature, and sees fictitious crimes neatly solved in storylines that satisfy the audience. Real-life crimes is not so simple, and unfortunately crimes do go unsolved and criminals do get away. 1. Who put Bella in the White Chelm? The story starts as dusk fell on Hagley Woods in Worcestershire on April 18, 1943. 4 young boys with a passion for bird nesting stumbled upon a heavily coppiced elm tree. The slightest of the group climbed up to peer inside its hollow trunk, where he discovered a human skull. Terrified, they swore a pact of silence and fled, but Tommy Willits, the youngest, was so traumatized that he told his father. Warwickshire police recovered skeletal remains from the bole of the tree, along with remnants of clothing and finger bones dispersed around the trunk. Pathologist Professor James Webster concluded that the remains belonged to a woman aged 35-40, who had been placed while still warm into the tree where she had remained hidden for at least 18 months. Cause of death was attributed to asphyxiation, on account of a portion of taffeta found deep inside her mouth. Police contacted every dentist in the country, hoping to identify the victim by her distinctive teeth. They also painstakingly eliminated all missing persons from the area. After 6 months, with police no closer to identifying the victim or her killer, the appearance of graffiti across the region, asking who put Bella down the White Chelm, suggested that someone knew more than they were letting on. Police honed their search to identify the graffiti artist, and followed the trail of anyone from the area known as Bella. Neither line of inquiry was successful. The search of national dental records also proved fruitless. The woman in the White Chelm had apparently come from nowhere and was missed by no one. 2 years passed. The case attracted the attention of the anthropologist Professor Margaret Murray, who clouded the investigation by citing a disturbing occult ceremony known as the Hand of Glory, theorizing that the scattered hand bones indicated a ritualistic murder. The press feasted on this latest detail, particularly when the body of local man Charles Walton was found in the nearby village of Lower Quinton, pinned to the ground with a pitchfork. Murray connected both cases, and Scotland Yard appeared to take the theory seriously, to the further delight of the press. By the early 1950s, talk of witchcraft had taken hold of the popular imagination. Then in 1953, a woman calling herself Anna contacted the Wolverhampton Express, and Star claiming to have known Bella's killers. She met police in secret, but details of her story were drip-fed to the public, by a local columnist writing as Quaster. Anna sent the case in a new direction, espionage. She claimed Bella had been murdered by a German spy ring involving a British officer, a Dutchman and a music hall artist. It was highly plausible. The region's many munitions factories had made it a prime target for Nazi intelligence gathering designed to choreograph the Birmingham Blitz. The public embraced the link between the Hagley Woods murder and espionage with relish. After all, this was the Cold War and James Bond had already made his debut in Ian Fleming's Casino Royale. Police soon dismissed talk of the occult and concluded that the finger bones had been scattered by animals, not by a satanic coven. Despite Anna's leads, the investigation began to gather dust. In 1968, the writer Donald McCormick revisited both murders in his book Murder by Witchcraft. He asserted that Bella had been a Nazi spy and occultist, named Clara Bella, a woman well known to several senior Nazis, recruited by the ABBA and given the codename Clara. He claimed to have gained access to ABBA records which indicated that she had parachuted into the West Midlands in 1941, but subsequently failed to make radio contact and disappeared. Furthermore, at least one piece of the contemporary graffiti, he claimed, referred not to Bella but to Clara Bella. It was an entertaining, if boldly uncorroborated theory and did nothing to help bring the case to resolution. 30 years later, the mystery endured despite continuing media interest, including from The Independent, which revisited the story in 1999. But the official closure of West Mercia Police's investigation, and publication of the case file has allowed it to be re-examined, and a startling conclusion presents itself. The police's final review acknowledges that while there would be some merit in a DNA investigation, they have been unable to ascertain where Bella was laid to rest. But they overlooked the fact that after the post-mortem, Bella's remains were not buried by the local constabulary, but were in fact passed to one of Professor Webster's colleagues at the University of Birmingham for more unofficial tests. The police were looking for Bella in the wrong cemetery. McCormick's theory may lack hard evidence, but in the 1960s there were only limited lines of inquiry available. He certainly couldn't have had access to wartime MI5 files, which detail the interrogation of a Czech-born Gestapo agent named Joseph Jacobs, arrested by the Home Guard after parachuting into Cambridgeshire in January 1941. His declassified file at the National Archives contains a photograph carried by Jacobs at the time of his arrest, which throws McCormick's claims into fascinating relief. The woman in the photograph was named by Jacobs as cabaret singer and German movie actress, Clara Bella. Jacobs told his interrogators that Clara was his lover, and that they had first met in Hamburg where she had been singing at the Café Dreyer with the EAT Orchestra. She was well connected with senior Nazis and had been recruited as a secret agent. She was due to parachute into the Midlands after Jacobs had established radio contact, but he claimed that since he had been captured before he could send word, this was now unlikely to happen. MI5 learned that Bauerl had been born in Stuttgart in 1906, making her 35. She was indeed a cabaret artist. In fact, she spent 2 years working the music halls of the West Midlands, before the war, and was said to speak English with a Birmingham accent. It isn't difficult to see how the name Clara Bauerl might have been more easily remembered as Clara Bella by English music hall audiences. And Anna would later allege a connection between Bella, espionage and music hall, in her letter to Quaster in 1953. The timings of these disparate strands of the story are remarkably convergent. Jacobs said that Clara had been due to parachute into the Midlands in the spring of 1941. Curiously, there appear to be no gramophone recordings, live performances or movie appearances bearing her name after this date. Her singing career appears to have come to an abrupt end. McCormick's agent Clara parachuted into the West Midlands in early 1941 and subsequently failed to make radio contact. Jacobs failed to convince MI5 that he could be reliably turned. In any case, MI5 noted in a memo that news of his capture was no secret, on account of the inability of the Home Guard to keep their mouths shut. On August 15, 1941, he was executed by firing squad, the last man to be put to death at the Tower of London. Unless the mortal remains of the woman found in Hagley Woods can be located, the fate of Jacobs' lover, Clara Bauerl, may prove to be as enduring a mystery as the question of who put Bella in the White Chelm. 2. The Seal Chart Murder. Caroline and Major General Charles Lard were upstanding members of their community in Kent, England. Then, tragedy struck, robbing them of the life they had built and enjoyed together. First, Caroline was found murdered at a neighbor's country home in Seal Chart, Kent. Just weeks later, Charles took his own life. And though there's been much speculation, the case, widely known as the Seal Chart murder, was never conclusively solved. Charles Lard was a former military man, a golfer, and a local politician who had founded the Patriotic Party. Caroline Lard was a well-liked friend, neighbor, and frequent volunteer for charitable causes. The parents of 2 grown sons, the couple was settling into the golden years of their life. Their social standing, as upper-class members of late Victorian society, made their untimely deaths particularly shocking and notable. The series of events began on August 24, 1908, a typical summer's day for 58-year-old Caroline, and 69-year-old Charles. They left their home together, on foot. At 2:30 p.m. Charles was headed to the golf club to retrieve his clubs, while Caroline was planning to enjoy some exercise before returning to the house for afternoon tea with a friend. At 3 p.m., they parted ways at a particular gate. She headed through the gate and down a path that would take her through the woods, past their neighbor's mostly unused summer house, and back to their home. Charles traveled onward to the golf club. Little did the couple know it would be the last time they ever bid each other farewell. Various townspeople saw the Major General over the next 35 minutes as he made his way to the club. At around 4:05 p.m., after leaving the club, the local vicar, driving in the opposite direction, promised him a ride home after completing an errand. The Reverend made good on this word, driving by again and picking Charles up at 4:20 p.m. and depositing him at his home at 4:25 p.m. Arriving at home, Charles was surprised to find Mrs. Stewart, the friend Caroline had promised to host for tea, waiting patiently for his wife's return. Upon realizing Carolyn was missing, Charles set off in search of her at 4:30 p.m. 45 minutes later. His search ended when he found her lifeless body on the veranda of their neighbor's summer house. She had been shot in the back of the head, twice, and her purse and rings were missing. No cartridges could be found. In fact, there was no evidence of the killer at all, save for a few footprints. In the aftermath of Carolyn's murder, many strangers and self-proclaimed experts determined that Charles had killed his wife, despite his tight alibi. He could account for his whereabouts at 3:15 p.m., the estimated time of the murder based on the accounts of a neighbor and a gardener, both of whom heard 3 shots fired in the general direction of the summer house. Furthermore, the Major General offered up all 3 of the revolvers he owned to the authorities, and none matched the bullet holes found in Carolyn's skull. Still, rumors proclaiming Charles' guilt spread. Some believe that Carolyn's missing rings had in fact been taken by Charles, to throw police off of his trail. Soon, Charles was receiving hate mail, from people vehemently accusing him of his wife's murder. As the days progressed with no new evidence leading to any likely suspect, Charles' hope of finding Carolyn's killer dwindled. Devastated, and a pariah in his community, he put his home up for sale. A member of Parliament, Colonel Ward, offered Charles a place to stay. On September 17, as soon as the official inquest had ended, Colonel Ward collected the Major General and took him home. Additionally, the Luard's son, stationed in South Africa, had finally gotten news of the family tragedy. He was en route to England to be with his father the following day. On the morning of September 18, the day his son was due to arrive, Charles Luard woke up, showered, and walked to the local train station. There, he hid in the bushes beside the track, then committed suicide by jumping in front of a passing train. The General Major met his tragic end less than a month after his wife met hers. Luard's suicide fanned the flames of the seal chart murder mystery. In the ensuing years, investigators came to believe the crime was committed by someone Carolyn knew, rather than by a random passerby. They thought her rings had been taken in an attempt to mislead the authorities to the true motive of the murder. In 1914, Sir Sidney Rowan Hamilton, who went on to serve as Chief Justice of Bermuda in the 1930s, wrote a book about the unsolved murder that explored this line of thinking. He put forth the notion that Carolyn's killer was a man named John Dickman. Dickman was sentenced to death in 1910 for murdering a man on a train. Rowan Hamilton asserted that Dickman was connected to Carolyn Luard through an advertisement the former placed in the Times. He believed that Carolyn responded to John Dickman's advertisement, asking for financial help, by sending him a check, which Dickman then forged, possibly by changing the amount. Upon discovering the forgery, Carolyn contacted the man and arranged to meet with him, without telling her husband. So the theory goes, Dickman then murdered Carolyn at this meeting to cover his tracks. This is just a theory, however, and has never been conclusively proven. To this day, the seal chart murder case remains unsolved. 3. The murder of Marian Gilchrist. In 1925, William Gordon was released from Peterhead Prison in Scotland. Unbeknownst to the authorities, Gordon smuggled out a message from fellow prisoner, Oscar Slater. The message, written on waterproof paper and hidden under Gordon's tongue, was a plea for help. It was to be delivered to none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle first heard the name Oscar Slater years earlier. He became aware of the case when Slater was sentenced to death for the murder of Marian Gilchrist. The crime occurred on December 21, 1908 in Glasgow. Helen Lambie, the sole servant of the elderly Miss Marian Gilchrist, left her employer for a few minutes to get a newspaper. Shortly thereafter, Arthur Adams, who lived in the apartment directly below Miss Gilchrist, said he and his sisters heard 3 knocks on the ceiling. Thinking that Miss Gilchrist wanted his assistance, Adams went to investigate. When he arrived at Miss Gilchrist's door, he rang the bell. Although no one came to the door, he heard noises inside the apartment. He returned downstairs, but his sisters urged him to check on Miss Gilchrist one more time. He returned upstairs and was in front of the door when Helen Lambie returned from her errand. At about this time they glimpsed a man in the building's hallway. However, it didn't strike either of them as unusual. Perhaps it was another tenant or a visitor. At any rate, Adams told Helen what had been going on, and together they entered the apartment. To their horror, they discovered that Miss Gilchrist had been bludgeoned to death. Her personal papers had been rifled and a diamond brooch was stolen. There was a public outcry against the brutal murder. The police and the public wanted the crime to be solved quickly and the murderer put behind bars. Within 5 days the police announced that they were looking for a suspect. His name was Oscar Slater. At first glance it did seem that the police had found their man. Slater lived near Miss Gilchrist. He was known to the police for running an illegal gambling operation. He recently pawned a diamond brooch. Even more damning was the fact that soon after the murder Slater left the country under an assumed name. Slater was discovered in America. Once he was made aware of the accusations against him, Slater willingly returned. He was positive that he could prove his innocence. The brooch that he pawned did not match the description of Miss Gilchrist's brooch. He also had witnesses who could testify as to his location at the time in question. The police were not swayed by Slater's evidence. They were sure that he was the culprit. In addition to Slater's criminal history was the fact that the police had witnesses. After some coaching by the authorities, these people, including Helen Lambie, were sure that they'd seen Slater leaving the scene of the murder. Also, the police believed they found the murder weapon after a small hammer was found in Slater's possession. The trial was held in 1909. Despite the conflicting evidence, Oscar Slater was found guilty of the murder of Marian Gilchrist and sentenced to death. Slater's lawyers started a petition that urged mercy. 2 days before he was scheduled to die, Slater's sentence was changed to imprisonment with hard labor for life. Slater's lawyers also contacted Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. While Conan Doyle didn't approve of Slater or his lifestyle, it was clear that he was not the murderer of Marian Gilchrist. In 1912, Conan Doyle published The Case of Oscar Slater. It examined evidence brought forward at the trial and point by point proved that Slater was not the killer. For example, Conan Doyle explained that Slater traveled under an assumed name because he was traveling with his mistress. He was trying to avoid detection by his wife, not the police. And while it was true that Slater did possess a small hammer, it wasn't large enough to inflict the type of wounds that Miss Gilchrist had sustained. Conan Doyle stated that a medical examiner at the crime scene declared that a large chair, dripping with blood, seemed to be the murder weapon. Conan Doyle also concluded that Miss Gilchrist had opened the door to her murderers herself. He surmised that she knew the murderer. Despite the fact that Miss Gilchrist and Oscar Slater lived near one another, they had never met. The case of Oscar Slater caused some demand for a new trial. However, the authorities said the evidence didn't justify that the case be reopened. In 1914, there were more calls for a retrial. New evidence had come to light. Another witness was found that could verify Slater's whereabouts during the time of the crime. Also, it was learned that before Helen Lambie named Slater as the man she'd seen in the hallway the day of the murder, she had given the police another name. Unbelievably, the officials decided to let the matter rest. Conan Doyle was outraged. How the verdict could be that there was no fresh cause for reversing the conviction is incomprehensible. The whole case will, in my opinion, remain immortal in the classics of crime as the supreme example of official incompetence and obstinacy. Throughout the years, Conan Doyle raised the issue of the injustice against Oscar Slater. However, he was not successful in his efforts. Then in 1925 he received the message smuggled out of Peterhead prison. Oscar Slater didn't offer any new revelations. There was no new evidence. It was just a note from a desperate man who wanted justice. He begged Conan Doyle not to forget him and to try one more time to free him. Conan Doyle could not ignore Slater's heartfelt request. He fired off a fresh barrage of letters. He wrote to his influential friends, the press, and to the Secretary of State of Scotland. He made public appearances and began to gather other like-minded people to the cause. The movement slowly began to gather steam. The turning point was in 1927 when a book by Glasgow journalist, William Park, was published. The Truth About Oscar Slater re-examined the case. Park came to the same conclusion that Conan Doyle did years ago. Miss Gilchrist had likely known the murderer and had invited him into her home. Park speculated that Miss Gilchrist had argued with this person about a document that she possessed. During the argument, she was pushed and hit her head. Her assailant was then forced to make a decision. What would be worse? To have Marian Gilchrist recover from her wounds, and charge him with assault, or to kill her and be done with the matter? He chose to kill her. Libel laws prevented Park from naming this person in the book, However, he believed the murderer to be the victim's nephew. The book caused a huge uproar. Newspapers were full of information about the case. Witnesses came forth to talk about the police coaching them into naming Slater as the man they'd seen around the building that fateful day. On November 8, 1927, the Secretary of State for Scotland issued the following statement: Oscar Slater has now completed more than 18.5 years of his life sentence, and I have felt justified in deciding to authorize his release on license as soon as suitable arrangements can be made. Within a few days, Oscar Slater was a free man. However, the case was not totally a happy ending as far as Conan Doyle was concerned. Slater was released, not pardoned. As a result, the case had to be reopened and retried. At that point, Slater could apply for compensation from the government for the years of wrongful imprisonment. Conan Doyle and others gave money to Slater for his legal fees. In the end, Slater was cleared of all charges, and awarded £6,000 in compensation. Conan Doyle assumed that Slater would reimburse his supporters for his legal fees. After all, it was what Conan Doyle would have done. However, Slater saw the matter in a different way. He thought it was ridiculous that he had to pay court costs at all, and so he shouldn't have to pay them back. Conan Doyle didn't need the £1,000 that he had given for Slater's legal fees. What bothered him was that Slater seemed ungrateful for the support that he was given. Honor was very important to Conan Doyle, and he believed that Slater had behaved in a dishonorable manner. Conan Doyle wrote to Slater saying, "You seem to have taken leave of your senses. If you are indeed responsible for your actions, then you are the most ungrateful as well as the most foolish person whom I have ever known." Had Conan Doyle been alive in 1948, he probably would have disagreed with the newspaper notice about Oscar Slater's death. Oscar Slater dead at 78, reprieved murderer, friend of A. Conan Doyle. 4. Abduction of Elizabeth Canning. On January 1, 1753, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth Canning disappeared from a country lane in what is now the heart of London. Canning, who worked as a maid in London, had been spending New Year's Day with her aunt and uncle in Whitechapel and was walking back to London when she disappeared. After she failed to arrive in London, Canning's employer, John Wintlebury, contacted her mother, who then raised the alarm. A volunteer search consisting of friends, family members and Wintlebury began investigating the disappearance. Since there was no organized police force in London at the time, it was up to the volunteers to knock on doors, distribute advertisements and flyers, and offer a reward for any information leading to her safe return. While someone nearby had reported hearing a scream at the time of her disappearance, the search would peter out after several weeks. On January 29, however, Elizabeth Canning reappeared at her mother's house in obvious distress. The normally neatly dressed Canning appeared so bedraggled that her mother fainted on recognizing her daughter and seeing her condition. Along with bruises on her face and body and a bad cut near one ear, Canning was also half-starved and wearing only a petticoat and a bedgown. Neighbors and family members came to the house, and immediately began questioning Elizabeth Canning about what happened. They eventually managed to piece together a coherent story from Canning, who was obviously traumatized by her experience. According to her, she had been walking along the country lane when she was attacked by two thugs near Bedlam Hospital. They robbed her of her money along with the nice dress she had been wearing. After striking her on the head, the thugs dragged her to a nearby large house, while she was in a semi-conscious state. At the house, she was turned over to a group of women who then tried to force her into prostitution, and locked her in a hayloft when she refused. She was left there for weeks with nothing but a loaf of bread, a pitcher of water, and the mince pie that she had been carrying. Canning eventually managed to escape but injured her ear in the process. Though unable to identify the house in question, people hearing her story immediately suspected one particular house in the area that already had a sinister reputation. Not only was it filled with gypsies, derelicts and sneak thieves, but there were several loose women living there suspected of running a brothel. While Canning was far from certain based on the description of the house she was given, she eventually concluded that it was the right house. After being given some time to recover, Elizabeth Canning was questioned by an alderman who had doubts about her story but agreed to issue a warrant. Again, due to the lack of a formal police force, the search was carried out by volunteers. To lend a semi-official status to the search, the Lord Mayor, Sir Chris Gascoigne, supervised the search. Despite her frail condition, Elizabeth Canning was taken to the house as well to identify her abductors. All of the residents of that house were arrested and arraigned a few days later. The justice of the peace in question, who happened to be the famous author Henry Fielding, signed the arrest warrants. The mistress of the house, Susanna Wells, who preferred to be known as Mother Wells, and a second woman, Mary Squires, were accused by Canning of stealing her corsets. Wells was also accused of keeping a disorderly house, another name for brothel. Since Squires was widely suspected of being a gypsy, though her exact ethnic origin was never clear, Canning's accusation was considered proof enough and she was later went on trial for theft. Squires' son, John, was also suspected of being one of the men who had abducted Canning in the first place, though he managed to avoid arrest. Despite the international publicity the case generated, Sir Crisp Gascoigne decided to investigate further. Elizabeth Canning's description of the house had more than a few discrepancies, especially the room where she had supposedly been held. Mary Squires, for her part, produced witnesses who testified that she was in another town at the time of Canning's alleged abduction. She also had a remarkable appearance, including an extremely large nose and an inflated lower lip, which Elizabeth Canning never mentioned. Despite these discrepancies, Elizabeth Canning refused to recant her statement. This sparked a controversy that polarized English society. On one side were the Canaanites, Elizabeth's supporters, and on the other side were the Egyptians, based on the then popular notion that gypsies came from Egypt. Pubs across the country became embroiled in fights over the case, and large sums of money were raised on both sides, whether to defend or convict Mary Squires. It also became a celebrated cause in literary circles, with Henry Fielding, Tobias Smollett and Voltaire each weighing in on the case. Things became so heated that the Lord Mayor himself was dragged from his coach, and physically assaulted by a mob of Canning's supporters. After going on trial, Susanna Wells was publicly branded, with the letter T on her thumb, T standing for theft, and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Mary Squires was sentenced to be hanged. Afterward, Elizabeth Canning was praised as a public hero, and she was given a tidy sum of money courtesy of her supporters. Dissatisfied with the verdict, Sir Crisp Gascoigne reopened the investigation. After questioning one house resident whose testimony had been the most damaging against Mary Squires, Gascoigne managed to break down her story. He also questioned the witnesses who had provided the alibi for Squires. Based on this investigation and his doubts about Elizabeth Canning's story, he ordered her arrest for perjury and recommended that Mary Squires be released. Based on the reasonable doubt over the case, King George II granted a stay of execution for Mary Squires, and eventually a full pardon. All of this outraged the Canaanites, and some of them threw stones at the king's coach. It hardly ended there though. John Miles, the leader of the Canaanites, arranged to have the men who had provided Mary Squires with an alibi charged with perjury. They were quickly found not guilty and released. To avoid arrest, Elizabeth Canning dropped out of sight and only turned herself in after a new Lord Mayor was installed. Her trial began in April 1754, and went on for 7 days, with newspapers running pro and con editorials of the case. After a narrow vote, she was convicted of perjury, willful and corrupt, and sentenced to 1 month in prison, to be followed by her transportation to America for 7 years. Canning's defenders insisted that she had been telling the truth, though her accusers suggested she had made the whole story up. The verdict also thoroughly ruined Crisp Gascoigne's political career, since much of the outrage was linked to his investigation. Still, being sent to America was not that much of a hardship for Canning, since her supporters raised enough money to make her voyage comfortable. They also supplied her with money for a new start. After arriving in Connecticut, she became part of the household of Reverend Elisha Williams. Technically an indentured servant, she was treated more like a member of the family. After William's death in 1755, Canning married John Treat, a grandson of a former governor of Connecticut. They would have 4 children together before her death in 1773. She is buried somewhere in Wethersfield, Connecticut, though the exact location of her grave has been lost to history. Did Elizabeth Canning commit perjury? The case demonstrates many of the problems investigators face today, when dealing with traumatized witnesses. Some later commentators on the case have suggested that Canning may have experienced a form of post-traumatic amnesia, with many details, She recalled afterward being implanted in her mind by overeager supporters. Modern investigators are specifically trained to avoid leading questions to avoid contaminating victim recall, which may have happened in Elizabeth Canning's case. Whatever the actual facts of her disappearance, Elizabeth Canning's case demonstrates the power that the media had, long before the invention of the internet. Political careers were made and broken by newspaper editorials over the case. No real solution for what really happened in 1753 has ever been put forward, and John Paget's described the case as, in truth, perhaps, the most complete and most inexplicable judicial puzzle on record. And it still is today. 5. The disappearance of King John's treasure. John, King of England from 1199 to 1216, is remembered today for many reasons, most of them unfavorable. To children he is best known as the arch-villain in the Robin Hood story, and in history he is remembered as Bad King John, who lost most of the overseas possessions of the Angevin Empire, irritated the barons so much, that he was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, and lost his crown jewels in the Washington. The legend of John's lost treasure has been handed down, and grown in the telling for 700 years, largely by word of mouth, and anyone brought up in the fens has heard it from an early age. John was born on Christmas Eve, the youngest son of Henry II and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. As a child, John tended to be overshadowed by his older brother Richard. Like his father, John developed a reputation for violent rages which lead to him foaming at the mouth. Henry left no land to John when he died, so John was given the nickname John Lackland. In 1189, all of Henry's territory went to his oldest son, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart. In 1199, Richard was killed in France and John became the King of England. His reign started in an unfortunate way. In 1202, John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, was murdered. Many in Brittany believed that John was responsible for his murder, and they rebelled against John. The basic story of his lost treasures, as related by historians from the 13th century onwards, is that King John was traveling in the east of England in late 1216. By the autumn of 1216, John's fortunes had sunk to a new low. He had inherited the mighty Angevin Empire and England and France forged by his father Henry II, pawned to pay for the Crusades by his brother Richard, and squandered by himself. Having already lost his lands in Normandy to the French king, he had faced a rampaging French army on his own soil, aided and abetted by his own rebellious barons. The previous year he had been forced by them to sign the Magna Carta, reducing the powers of the crown. Although he had won some victories since then, he had earlier been excommunicated by the Pope, and his whole country had been placed under an interdict from Rome. Every church in England was ordered to be closed. On October 9, 1216, though, he arrived in Lynn, one of the few places where he was still popular. He had journeyed from Lincolnshire to Bishop's Lynn, now King's Lynn, in Norfolk, but when he arrived he began to feel ill. It was decided that he would return back towards Lincolnshire, which was probably thought to be safer at this time, as the French king, Louis, had recently invaded the country to the south. On 12 October, John attempted to cross the Wash, the large bay that separates East Anglia from Lincolnshire. At this time it extended much further inland than it does today, and would have been a region of mudflats and marshes, traversable at low tide but dangerous to the unwary, riddled with quicksand and deeper channels, and vulnerable to rapid movements of water with the tide. Historians disagree about many aspects of this tale. For would-be treasure hunters, one of the most interesting issues is the question of what the king actually lost. Although it is traditionally said that he lost the crown jewels, there is no contemporary record that says exactly this. Roger de Wendover's Floris Historiarum, Flowers of History, written around 1230, gives the lost loot as treasures, precious vessels, and all the other things which he cherished with special care. Ralph of Coggeshall's Chronicon Anglicanum describes it as his chapel with its relics and diverse household effects. Another source describes the king's princely carriage and furniture. In his book Undiscovered, Ian Wilson surveys the theories about John's lost treasure, and points out that the official records of the time show that the king was moving round the countryside at quite a rate, sometimes as much as 60 kilometers, 37 miles, a day. This suggests that he was not accompanied by a large baggage train, which in that day and age would have been extremely sluggish. So perhaps the contemporary accounts are exaggerated. Set against this is the evidence that genuinely valuable treasure was lost that October day. King John's favorite hobby was collecting jewelry, while as monarch he also owned a heart of gold and silver plate and other valuables, which he had spent much of 1215 and 1216 gathering together from the various monasteries where it was deposited. Of particular value were the imperial regalia he had inherited from his grandmother, the Empress of Germany, which made up part of his crown jewels. During John's reign all this treasure is listed in the royal inventories called the rolls, which John himself instituted, but most of it is absent from the inventory of regalia used during the coronation of John's successor, Henry III in 1220. In other words, it seems likely that a priceless collection of royal valuables did indeed disappear. After John's death, rumors proliferated that he had been poisoned, probably via those quantities of pears, and peaches, and new cider laid out for him by the monks of Swineshead. Although most modern historians discount these rumors, not everyone agrees, and medieval conspiracy theories have been advanced, based on the coincidence between the loss of the king's treasure and his untimely death. Another theory suggests that the crown jewels were not lost at all, but were either sold, used by John as collateral for loans, with the wash incident being staged as a kind of misdirection or medieval fraud. Whatever maleficent plan the king was hatching was cut short by his premature death, murder, and the treasure was subsequently stolen. At least one contemporary report speaks of suspiciously heavily laden men seen leaving Newark in the wake of his death. There's absolutely no evidence for this, but it makes a good story. The ailing king made it to Newark Castle, where he died, aged 49, on October 18th, just 2 days after re-entering Lincolnshire. He was buried at Worcester, minus his missing regalia. Maybe someone else did make off with the loot and the lost treasure in the wash story was just a ruse to cover the glaring absence of the jewels. Certainly it reinforces the negative image of King John that even recent revisionist historians have not been able to change. We have to ask if a suspicious character like John would really travel without his most precious jewels. If the treasure is really buried somewhere near modern-day Sutton Bridge, then it would be covered by 20 feet or more of silt, so we can all put our metal detectors away. But that hasn't stopped people looking. During the 1930s a group of American treasure hunters paid local farmers $2.60 an acre for their help in looking for the jewels at Walpole Island. More recently a team from Nottingham University took soil samples in a bid to discover the causeway the wagon train used. The search goes on. We may never know the truth. In the 14th century it was commonly rumored that Robert, Lord Tiptoft, had salvaged the treasure, setting himself up as a wealthy man in the North Country on the proceeds. According to East Anglian folklorist W. Dutt, local legend in the Sutton area talks of King John's Hole, a pool where the jewels were hidden, either by John himself for some nefarious purpose, or by those who recovered them after the disaster in the Washington. The pool is said to be on the southern side of the King's Lynn along Sutton Road. But it is possible that this booty hidden in the hole has already been recovered. In the 14th century local Baron Robert, 3rd Lord Tiptoft, suddenly became immensely wealthy. There was no apparent source for his sudden affluence, and rumors spread that Tiptoft had discovered King John's lost treasure. So perhaps there is nothing out there left to recover. 6. The Pitchfork Murder. The brutal murder of Charles Walton, on February 14, 1945, remains one of Britain's strangest unsolved cases. Seemingly motiveless, riddled with rumors of occult practices, and hampered by a wall of silence from potential witnesses, it confounded even the greatest detective of the time, Scotland Yard's legendary Robert Fabian. On the day of his murder, Walton, a 74-year-old farmhand, went to work in the morning as normal in the town of Lower Quinton. His niece, Edith, with whom he shared a small home, grew concerned as darkness fell without any sign of him. Eventually, she set out to search for him, together with his employer, Alfred Potter, and his colleague, Harry Beasley. What they found was shocking. Walton's body lay near a hedgerow, in the field in which he had been working that day. His billhook, a tool used for hedge trimming, was buried in his neck. A pitchfork was also driven through his throat. The pronged tool had been plunged so violently that its prongs were bent back from striking the frozen ground beneath. Walton's walking stick was found nearby with blood and hair on it, indicating a vicious beating. The murder was so brutal and so baffling, local police made the decision to bring in Scotland Yard. Upon arriving in Lower Quinton, Chief Inspector Fabian immediately started looking at those Walton interacted with on a daily basis as possible suspects. Inquiries revealed that Walton's employer, Albert Potter, was dishonest and bad-tempered. He was often late paying employees, as he was allegedly embezzling funds and juggling the remaining cash between creditors to keep them from finding out. Furthermore, when questioned, Potter's story was inconsistent, changing several times during different interviews. Fabian considered Potter the prime suspect, but never gathered enough evidence to charge him. When attempting to question locals about the crime, however, Fabian encountered a wall of silence. When villagers would speak, they said as little as possible. Some wouldn't talk at all. Were they wary of outsiders? Or did they have something to hide? The lack of possible suspects combined with the villagers' eerie silence and the horrific state of Walton's body led to a sinister rumor: Walton's murder was occult-related. The location of the murder only fanned the flames of such rumors. The farmhand had been slain near Marian Hill, a place known locally for its supposedly supernatural links. Furthermore, Walton was killed on February 14th. According to Wikipedia, that date, under the old calendar, marked the pagan festival Imbolc, leading some to believe the murder was part of some ancient ritual. There were also rumors about Walton himself that suggested an occult-related murder. Some believed the farmhand to be a witch, with the ability to cast the evil eye upon fellow villagers, and famine upon fellow farmers. It is suggested that he had been blamed for a poor harvest in 1944, and was subsequently murdered ritualistically, so that his blood might soak back into the soil, and renew it. Another rumor, occult in nature, spread in the wake of Walton's demise, that a black dog had been seen lurking in the area where he died. The superstitious inhabitants of Quinton believed that black dogs were a harbinger of death. Even Fabian reported seeing a black dog while investigating near Marian Hill. It's likely we'll never know the truth about Walton's murder. The perpetrator was never apprehended, and the motive never uncovered, making the bizarre and horrific case of the pitchfork murder the longest-running unsolved slaying in the history of the Warwickshire Constabulary. At the time of his investigation, Fabian fervently denied any occult-related activity associated with Walton's grisly death. However, 25 years later, Fabian made this ominous statement in his book, The Anatomy of Crime: "I advise anybody who is tempted at any time to venture into black magic, witchcraft, shamanism, call it what you will, to remember Charles Walton and to think of his death, which was clearly the ghastly climax of a pagan rite. There is no stronger argument for keeping as far away as possible from the villains with their swords, incense and mumbo-jumbo. It is prudence on which your future peace of mind and even your life could depend." 7. The Pizenhall Murder. 22-year-old Rose Harsand was a pretty, robust, country girl who resided in the remote Suffolk village of Pizenhall. She was employed by Deacon William Crisp, a Baptist elder, as a domestic servant at Providence House. On May 31, 1902, Rose received an anonymous letter arranging to come and meet her at midnight. As the time approached for the late-night assignation, Rose made her way down the servants' staircase leading to the kitchen. The following morning, William Harsand came to Providence House to pay his daughter, Rose, a visit. When he entered the cottage through the back door, he encountered Rose laying at the foot of the stairs. Her throat had been cut, she had deep gashes on her shoulders, and her nightdress was charred. The police and a doctor were summoned, and soon realized that the scene was made to look like she had tripped down the steps, and cut herself with the oil lamp, and that the lamp had caught her nightdress on fire. They found that the fire had actually been started by a newspaper, and also found a broken medicine bottle containing paraffin near the body. When the police searched Rose's room, they uncovered the anonymous letter, and the handwriting was eventually traced back to one William Gardner. Gardner, a married man with 6 children, was considered a pillar of the community. He was a foreman at Pizenhall Cathedral Works, an elder at the local Primitive Methodist Church, in addition to being the choir master. Rose Harsand also attended the church and was a member of the choir. When an autopsy was performed, Rose Harsand was found to be 6 months pregnant. To authorities, there was no doubt that the father of the child was William Gardner, and that the pregnancy was the motive for her murder. The previous year the two had been involved in a scandal. Their illicit affair had been uncovered when two young men from the village, George Wright and Alfonso Skinner, noticed the pair entering an empty cottage known as the Doctor's Chapel. Once they were inside, the young men crept closer, and soon they heard the unmistakable sounds of an intimate nature coming from inside. The two wasted no time spreading the gossip of what they had seen and heard. Apparently Gardner and Rose had continued their sordid relationship even though he had been severely chastised by his pastor. As an elder of the church he was expected to be above reproach, and it did not sit well with the members of the community that he had seduced an innocent young girl. During his interrogation Gardner denied any involvement in Rose's murder. He stated that he had been at home in bed with his wife at the time of the murder, an alibi which she staunchly corroborated. The evidence, albeit circumstantial, against Gardner was overwhelming. The newspaper used to start the fire had been brought to the crime scene as neither the Crisps or Rose subscribed to it. The broken medical bottle of paraffin had been prescribed for the Gardner children. Gardner's clasp knife was stained with blood. He claimed he had used it to cut up rabbits. Unfortunately at that time there was no way to test if it was human or animal blood. Neighbors testified that they had seen a large fire burning in the backyard of the Gardner's house on the morning after the murder. The prosecution would later argue that this explained why there were no blood-stained clothing found in the house. The first trial took place on November 7, 1902. In those days the jury had to reach a unanimous verdict in a murder trial. The jury returned with a count of 11-1 in favor of conviction. The judge ordered a retrial which commenced on January 21, 1903. This time the jury returned with a count of 10-2 in favor of acquittal. Once again a retrial was ordered, except this time, authorities not hopeful of securing a conviction, entered a plea of nolle prosequi and the case against Gardner was dismissed. He and his family moved to a suburb in London and into relative obscurity. Speculation of Gardner's guilt or innocence has persisted ever since. It was his wife's determined support of him that went a long way in convincing others of his innocence. It was also uncovered that Rose was not quite the innocent she was portrayed to be. She was purported to have a string of lovers. In addition to the letter from Gardner there were lewd poetry and suggestive notes written to her by other men from the village, adding to the list of potential suspects. In fact, William Gardner could be the one providing the alibi for the one woman who stood to lose the most if Rose gave birth, his wife, Georgie Gardner. 8. The murder of Florence Nightingale's goddaughter. Florence Nightingale Shore was the goddaughter of the famous lady with the lamp who worked as a nurse in Sunderland, England. Florence was born in 1865, and attended boarding school in York before completing her education in Belgium. She then relocated to China where she worked as a governess for 3 years, before returning to England and training as a nurse. The life of a Victorian nurse was not easy, and Florence would have been expected to work long hours for just £10 a year plus board. In 1920, Florence boarded a train travelling to Sussex, where she planned to meet friends for a short holiday at St. Leonard's. While aboard she was attacked and severely beaten, dying from her injuries just days later. A nationwide investigation was launched with an unnamed man in a brown suite becoming the lead suspect in the case. Unfortunately, despite the police's best efforts to try and find Florence's killer and bring them to justice, both the reason behind the attack and the identity of her attacker remain a mystery. The unsolved murder of Florence Nightingale's goddaughter has been investigated in a new book for the first time. Derby-born Florence Nightingale Shore, who was named after the famous nurse, was brutally assaulted on a train in 1920. She had suffered head injuries and died 4 days later. Her killer was never found. Now a new book looks at theories which could point to the murderer. The author, Rosemary Cook, who is director of the Queen's Nursing Institute in London, started researching the death of Miss Shore after she read about her in a nursing magazine. Miss Shore, who grew up in Stafford Street, Derby, was also a nurse and worked in South Africa during the Second Boer War and France in the First World War. Ms. Cook had been looking through old copies of Queen's Nurses magazine in preparation for the 150th anniversary of the Queen's Nursing Institute. The death of Miss Shore, whose father was a doctor at Derbyshire Royal Infirmary, was mentioned in an issue from 1920. It said that the 55-year-old was discovered with serious head injuries on a train in Bigsill, Sussex. She later died in hospital. Ms. Cook said, "There was very little detail. It just said that she had been found seriously injured. I thought, there must be a great story here. I wondered whether she had a connection to Florence Nightingale, and I found out she was her goddaughter. I was intrigued, and started to do some research to find out more about her and her murder." The book looks into different theories, including that the killer was her close friend, Mabel Rogers, with whom she had spent the day. "I found a website run by a man in America who is a distant relative to Miss Shore, and he came up with a fascinating theory," said Ms. Cook. He suggested she and Mabel had a row on the train. Ms. Cook also researched the police's investigation and the conclusions of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the celebrated Home Office pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on Miss Shore's body. She said, "There was a lot of interest at the time in the man in the brown suit who left the train at the stop before Bigsill, as well as at least 2 false confessions to the crime. The most exciting find for me from my research was a witness, who was interviewed by a journalist. The man claimed to have been the first into the carriage to find Florence injured, and he could describe the scene in detail. Yet no one else at the scene remembers him, and he was never called to give evidence at the inquest." Ms. Cook, who spent a year writing the book, fears the murder may never be solved. "In those days, it was fairly primitive, but today we have DNA testing," she said. But she hopes that her book will give Miss Shore more recognition. "I want people to know about her as a nurse and not just as a murder victim," she said. There is correspondence that exists between her and Florence Nightingale, where she talks about her nursing training. She was very brave. As a nurse in France during the First World War, the ward was being bombed, but she refused to shelter. 8. The murder of Florence Nightingale's goddaughter. Florence Nightingale Shore was the goddaughter of the famous lady with the lamp who worked as a nurse in Sunderland, England. Florence was born in 1865, and attended boarding school in York before completing her education in Belgium. She then relocated to China, where she worked as a governess for 3 years, before returning to England and training as a nurse. The life of a Victorian nurse was not easy, and Florence would have been expected to work long hours for just £10 a year plus board. In 1920, Florence boarded a train traveling to Sussex, where she planned to meet friends for a short holiday at St. Leonard's. While aboard, she was attacked and severely beaten, dying from her injuries just days later. A nationwide investigation was launched with an unnamed man in a brown suite becoming the lead suspect in the case. Unfortunately, despite the police's best efforts to try and find Florence's killer, and bring them to justice, both the reason behind the attack and the identity of her attacker remain a mystery. The unsolved murder of Florence Nightingale's goddaughter has been investigated in a new book for the first time. Derby-born Florence Nightingale Shore, who was named after the famous nurse, was brutally assaulted on a train in 1920. She had suffered head injuries and died 4 days later. Her killer was never found. Now a new book looks at theories which could point to the murderer. The author, Rosemary Cook, who is director of the Queen's Nursing Institute in London, started researching the death of Miss Shore after she read about her in a nursing magazine. Miss Shore, who grew up in Stafford Street, Derby, was also a nurse and worked in South Africa during the Second Boer War and France in the First World War. Ms. Cook had been looking through old copies of Queen's Nurses magazine in preparation for the 150th anniversary of the Queen's Nursing Institute. The death of Miss Shore, whose father was a doctor at Derbyshire Royal Infirmary, was mentioned in an issue from 1920. It said that the 55-year-old was discovered with serious head injuries on a train in Bigsill, Sussex. She later died in hospital. Ms. Cook said, "There was very little detail. It just said that she had been found seriously injured. I thought, there must be a great story here. I wondered whether she had a connection to Florence Nightingale, and I found out she was her goddaughter. I was intrigued, and started to do some research to find out more about her and her murder." The book looks into different theories, including that the killer was her close friend, Mabel Rogers, with whom she had spent the day. "I found a website run by a man in America who is a distant relative to Miss Shore, and he came up with a fascinating theory," said Ms. Cook. He suggested she and Mabel had a row on the train. Ms. Cook also researched the police's investigation and the conclusions of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the celebrated Home Office pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on Miss Shore's body. She said, "There was a lot of interest at the time in the man in the brown suit who left the train at the stop before Bigsall, as well as at least 2 false confessions to the crime. The most exciting find for me from my research was a witness, who was interviewed by a journalist. The man claimed to have been the first into the carriage to find Florence injured, and he could describe the scene in detail. Yet no one else at the scene remembers him, and he was never called to give evidence at the inquest." Ms. Cook, who spent a year writing the book, fears the murder may never be solved. "In those days, it was fairly primitive, but today we have DNA testing," she said. But she hopes that her book will give Miss Shore more recognition. "I want people to know about her as a nurse and not just as a murder victim," she said. There is correspondence that exists between her and Florence Nightingale, where she talks about her nursing training. She was very brave. As a nurse in France during the First World War, the ward was being bombed, but she refused to shelter.